Marla Hayes had grown used to being invisible. Near midnight, as she pushed her laundry cart through the corridor behind the hotel, no one spared a glance for the night shift maid, not until she heard a ragged breath coming from behind the row of dumpsters. A man lay slumped in the dark. His expensive suit was torn apart, one side of it soaked crimson, his trembling hand gripping the brick wall as if it were the only thing keeping him tethered to life. He looked up at her, not begging, not a single word, just waiting in silence. At the far end of the alley, 3 figures in black were drawing closer, one step at a time. Marla had only 3 seconds to decide. She had no idea who this man was. She didn't know that if she saved him tonight, the city's entire underworld would remember her name. And she could never have guessed that the man she was about to hide beneath a pile of white towels was someone even the police didn't dare name aloud a crime boss. Yet had Marla known the truth about the man she was saving that night, she might have handed him over to those 3 herself. If this story touches your heart, please leave a like and share to spread it to more people. Don't forget to subscribe to our channel so you don't miss the next heartwarming stories. To understand why, we have to go back to the very beginning. Those 3 seconds felt as long as an entire lifetime. Marla didn't have time to think anything through. Only her hands acted, moving before reason could stop them. She flipped back the tarp covering the laundry cart, shoved the stack of towels hurriedly to one side, then slipped her hands beneath the man's arms. He was far heavier than she had imagined, and each time she pulled, he swallowed a groan deep in his throat, fighting to keep it from breaking into sound. "Hold on, we're almost there," she whispered, her voice trembling so badly that even she barely recognized it as her own. With a strength she would later never understand where she had found, she managed to push him fully into the hollow of the cart, then covered him with the layer of white towels, burying him beneath them as though no one had ever been there at all. She had only just placed her hands on the push bar when 3 shadows blocked the way right in front of her. They weren't rushing, they weren't panting for breath, and it was precisely that calmness that sent an icy chill crawling up the back of her neck. The tallest man in the middle took 1 step forward, his gaze sweeping over her from head to toe, as if weighing how much she was worth. "Girl," he said, his voice low and even, the kind of voice that belonged to a man used to being feared. "Did you see a man run through here? Wearing a suit, wounded." Marla's heart hammered so violently that she was certain they could hear it. She gripped the push bar tightly to hide her shaking hands, forcing herself to look straight into his eyes instead of glancing down at the towels. One glance would be enough to kill them both. "No," she answered, trying to keep her voice flat, as if she was too exhausted to care. "I work the night shift. It's only been me here this whole time. I haven't seen anyone." He didn't answer right away. He tilted his head, his eyes narrowing, and that stretch of silence dragged on until Marla felt as if every passing second was slicing into her skin. One of the 2 men behind him stepped closer to the cart and reached out, about to lift the tarp. Marla swallowed hard, the words spilling out of her mouth faster than thought itself. "That's dirty laundry. Towels with a guest's blood on them from upstairs. I'm taking them to be washed. You gentlemen can dig through them if you want, but I'm not responsible if it gets on your hands." The words, which had sounded almost careless, made the man freeze. He grimaced and drew his hand back. The man in the middle watched Marla for 1 more beat. Then, as if he had found what he needed in the worn-out desperation on her face, he gave a slight jerk of his head to signal his men. "Go." All 3 turned on their heels and walked toward the far end of the hallway, the sound of their shoes growing smaller and smaller before dissolving into the darkness, leaving Marla standing there with lungs that seemed to have forgotten how to breathe. She didn't dare stop. Pushing the cart quickly while still trying to keep the unhurried air of someone simply doing her job, she slipped around 2 turns, opened the storage room door at the end of the corridor, then rolled the cart inside and slammed the door shut behind her. Only when the latch gave a dry, hard click did she allow herself to sag for a moment. Both hands braced against the side of the cart. She pulled the towel back. Under the dim yellow light of the storage room, she saw his face clearly for the first time. It wasn't the face of a man begging for pity. Though his skin was pale from blood loss, though sweat gleamed across his forehead, his eyes still held something cold and distant, as if even while standing on the thinnest edge of survival, he was still accustomed to controlling everything around him. He looked at her, and in that instant, she had the strange feeling that she was the one being judged. His lips moved. Marla bent closer to hear him. His voice was no more than a faint rasp, yet every word was terrifyingly clear. "Don't call the police." He stopped and dragged in a painful breath. You don't understand what you just did." Then his eyes closed, and his head fell to one side. He had passed out. Marla stood frozen in the dark room, her hand still clutching the towel, her heart pounding hard against her ribs. She had just lied to 3 men whose eyes were colder than a Chicago winter. She had just hidden a wounded stranger in the very place where she worked. And with a vague instinct rising from the deepest part of her chest, she understood that the door she had just closed behind her wasn't merely the door to a storage room. It was the door leading into something that, once crossed, would never allow her to turn back again. To understand why a woman would risk her life for a stranger in that alley at night, one has to know what kind of life Marla Hayes had lived. She was only 28 years old, but her shoulders already carried the weight of someone twice her age. 2 years earlier, her husband had died after an accident, leaving so suddenly that she hadn't even had time to say goodbye, only to receive a stack of papers and debts she hadn't even known he had taken on. From that day forward, she carried everything alone. By day, she stayed home with her little daughter, Posy, a 5-year-old girl with golden curls and a smile that could make all Marla's exhaustion disappear for a little while. By night, when the whole city had sunk into sleep, she put on her housekeeping uniform, caught the last bus to the hotel, and quietly did the kind of work no one wanted to look at. She wiped down empty hallways, cleaned the rooms people left in disorder, and pushed carts piled high with dirty towels through passageways where even the lights seemed too tired to shine. People passed her the way they passed a shadow, and she had grown so used to it that she no longer even felt wounded by it. Every morning, before dawn had fully broken, she returned to the cramped apartment on the 3rd floor of an old building, where the rent was always a few days late, and the landlord had stopped mentioning it because he knew there was no use. Mrs. Eleanor, the elderly woman who lived right next door, was the only person Marla could depend on. She watched Posy during the hours Marla was at work, and in return, Marla bought her a little medicine, sometimes cooking an extra portion of food so the old woman and the child could eat together. That was all Marla could give back, and Mrs. Eleanor had never asked for anything more. That morning, like every morning, Marla opened the door quietly so she wouldn't wake anyone, and saw Posy sleeping curled up on the old sofa, her tiny hand clutching the stuffed rabbit, whose fur had worn thin. Marla bent down, pressed a kiss to her daughter's forehead, and the little girl stirred softly, opened her eyes, and smiled at her mother. It was in that rare, peaceful moment that a worry Marla had been trying to bury rose up again. Lately, Posy had been getting tired more quickly than other children. After only a little running around in the yard, she would have to sink down and gasp for breath, her lips sometimes taking on a faint bluish shade before turning pink again. Marla had meant to take her to a doctor, but every time she thought about the hospital bill, she comforted herself by saying that maybe the child was only a little weaker than normal, that maybe she would grow stronger as she got older. She didn't allow herself to think any further than that, because if she did, she was afraid she wouldn't have enough strength left to keep going. The most remarkable thing about Marla wasn't that she suffered, but that she had never let suffering turn her into someone bitter. She didn't complain to anyone, didn't blame fate, didn't look at people luckier than herself with envy in her eyes. She simply did what had to be done, day after day, with a quiet kind of dignity that people who lived comfortably rarely understood. She believed that no matter how much life took from her, it couldn't take away her right to be kind. And perhaps it was that stubborn, enduring belief, more than anything else, that made her hands act on their own in that alley that night, before her mind had even had time to weigh whether doing so was foolish or wise. She didn't save that man because she knew who he was. She saved him simply because she was someone who couldn't stand by and watch a life fade out right in front of her without doing anything at all. And she couldn't possibly have known that this very nature of hers was about to pull her and her little girl into a storm greater than anything she had ever endured. To understand who the man lying unconscious in that storage room truly was, one has to step back a little in time, to the night before fate drove him into the alley behind the hotel. Dorian Vale sat at the head of a long table in the room on the top floor of the building that bore his name, where the entire city spread out beneath him like a carpet of lights, and not one of the men seated around that table dared speak before he allowed it. He didn't need to raise his voice to make other people fall silent. Silence seemed to radiate from him by itself, from the way he sat straight and motionless, from the dark eyes that looked directly at the person across from him without blinking. In Chicago, people passed the name Dorian Vale from mouth to mouth in lowered voices, and even men in uniform avoided mentioning him in crowded places. That night, standing in the middle of the room was a man named Briggs, someone Dorian had once trusted with overseeing a market on the southern side of the city. Briggs had done the thing Dorian despised most. He had forced the poor vendors in that market to pay extra protection money beyond the amount already agreed upon, pocketed the difference for himself, and when an elderly street vendor didn't have enough money, he had ordered his men to overturn her stall in broad daylight as a warning to others. Dorian knew everything. He always knew. He let Briggs stand there for a long while, long enough for sweat to begin beading on the man's forehead, and only then did he slowly speak, his voice even and cold as the surface of a frozen lake. "Do you know what makes me different from the men you used to work for before this, Briggs?" The man stammered, unable to answer. Dorian rose, walked around the table, each of his steps unhurried, as though he had all the time in the world. "I don't care how much money you make. I don't care how greedy you are. But there is one thing I'll never forgive, and that is the strong crushing those weaker than themselves. That woman had only one stall to keep herself alive, and you trampled it just for amusement." He stopped directly in front of Briggs, and although he hadn't raised a hand, the man still took a step back, as if pushed away by an invisible weight. "You think power exists for that? You're wrong. Power exists to protect those who can't protect themselves. A man who doesn't understand that isn't worthy of working under me." He turned toward the man standing quietly by the door, a tall man with a calm face named Wade, the right-hand man he trusted most, and gave only a slight nod. "Take him outside. Return every dollar to the people in that market, with compensation added, and see that the old woman gets a new stall." Briggs was led away without daring to utter another word, while the others in the room remained seated in silence, none of them daring to breathe too loudly, because every one of them understood that the principle Dorian had just spoken was not an empty threat. It was the unbreakable law he lived and died by, a law no one dared ask the origin of. Only a very few people, and Wade was one of them, could faintly guess that behind that absolute coldness lay some old wound from the time before Dorian became a boss, something that had happened long ago to someone he had been unable to protect, and it was that silent pain that had forged him into the man he was today. But no one dared press him, and Dorian had never told the story. He only turned back to look out through the glass window, silently watching the glittering city below, never knowing that in only a few more hours, he himself would be the one who needed a stranger's hand to reach out and save him. Dorian woke beneath a strange kind of light, a sickly yellow glow spilling from an old table lamp and casting itself across a ceiling stained with uneven patches. It took him a few seconds to remember where he was, or more precisely, to realize he didn't know where he was at all. By instinct, his hand went immediately to his side, and a sharp bolt of pain shot through him, making him clench his teeth. But he discovered that the wound had been carefully bandaged with clean strips of cloth. He sat up too quickly, dizziness flooding his head, his eyes sweeping the cramped little room with the wary alertness of an animal waking in an unfamiliar den. A narrow apartment, old furniture but neatly kept, a wooden table with peeling paint, a few picture frames turned face down, and the faint smell of weak coffee lingering in the air. Sitting a few steps away from him, on a small stool, was the woman from the alley. She was holding a glass of water, and when she saw that he was awake, she neither backed away nor came closer. She only watched him in silence, cautious and still. "You shouldn't move too much," she said softly. "The wound has only just stopped bleeding. If you keep shifting around, it'll tear open again." Dorian stared at her, his mind working rapidly, fitting every scattered piece of information together in an effort to understand what was happening. "Where is this?" he asked, his voice hoarse, though it still carried that familiar cold edge. "My apartment," she answered. "I couldn't leave you in the storage room. By morning, someone would have found you. I waited until my shift was over, then brought you here through the back door. Lucky thing you could walk a few steps, because otherwise I wouldn't have managed it." He remained silent for a long while, searching her voice and her eyes for some sign of calculation, a trap, some hidden motive, because in the world he lived in, no one did anything without wanting something in return. "Do you know who I am?" he asked, narrowing his eyes. She shook her head. "No, and honestly, I don't want to know. The men chasing you didn't look like decent people, and you don't exactly look like one either. All I know is that if I'd walked away back then, you probably wouldn't be sitting here asking me these questions now." That blunt answer made him pause. He was used to people either fearing him or trying to use him. But this woman seemed to belong to neither kind. "Then why?" he asked, And for the first time, there was something in his voice close to genuine confusion. Why would you save a stranger? What do you gain from it? You don't know who I am. You don't know what I've done. You don't know whether saving me has put you in danger. A wise person would have turned her back and walked away. Marla looked at him, and there was no fear left in her eyes now, only a strange quietness. Maybe I'm not wise, she said, but I can't stand there and watch someone die right in front of me without doing anything. I think everyone deserves a chance to live, even if I don't know whether they're good or bad. A human life isn't something I can just sit there weighing in my hands, deciding whether it's worth saving. Dorian didn't answer right away. He looked at the thin woman in this poor little room, the woman who had just risked her own life to hide him from men who wouldn't have hesitated to harm her too, and he felt something unfamiliar stir faintly inside his chest, something he thought he had buried a very long time ago. It had been so long, since that fateful day in his childhood, since he had last encountered a person willing to stretch out their arms and shield someone else without demanding anything in return, and that blurred memory disturbed him far more than it moved him. He turned his face away, his voice returning to its hard edge. You just did something foolish. Someone like you shouldn't get involved with someone like me. But even as he said it, he already knew, vaguely and against his will, that he would never be able to forget this woman. Dorian stayed in that apartment for 2 more days, long enough for the wound to become less dangerous, and for him to recover the small measure of strength he needed. During those 2 days, he spoke very little, spending most of his time lying there in silence, watching the way that woman managed her life, the way she left every night and returned every morning with exhaustion carved into her face, yet never once allowed a complaint to leave her lips. He noticed that she always saved the better portion of food for someone else, wrapping it carefully before taking it to the room next door, and though he didn't ask, he could guess that in this hard-pressed life of hers, there was another small living soul depending on her. He didn't press her about it, because it was none of his business, and because he knew that the deeper he entangled himself in her life, the closer he would pull her toward the dangerous world he belonged to. By the morning of the 3rd day, while Marla was in the room next door, Dorian quietly got to his feet. He was strong enough to walk on his own now, and his men, the ones who were truly loyal, had managed to trace the place where he had been hiding, and were waiting for him on a street corner not far away. He wasn't used to saying thank you. In all his life, he had never had to owe anyone, and he had never learned how to express gratitude properly, so he did the only thing his world had taught him to do, the only language he believed carried any real weight. He took an envelope from inside his coat, slipped a thick stack of money into it, more than Marla could have earned in an entire year of working herself to the bone, then placed it neatly on the wooden table, with the peeling paint, beneath the foot of the lamp. In his mind, it was the cleanest way to repay a debt of kindness, a way to make her life a little less difficult, and a way for him to owe no one anymore. He didn't leave a single written line, not one message, only closed the door quietly and left before she could return. But that evening, something happened that Dorian hadn't expected at all. When Marla came back to the apartment and saw the envelope, she stood frozen for a while. She opened it, and when she saw the amount of money inside, her face went pale. But her reaction wasn't joy. She looked around the empty room, then looked back at the envelope, and there was only one thought in her mind, that the man had gone, that perhaps this was money he had dropped or forgotten in his hurry, because she couldn't possibly believe a stranger would leave her such a large sum. The next morning, she took the entire envelope to the hotel, handed it to the front desk, and asked them to hold it, in case the mysterious wounded stranger she found in the alley came back looking for his belongings, refusing to keep a single dollar that wasn't hers. She didn't even keep one single bill, though just one would have been enough to cover the rent she already owed. When word of that reached Dorian through one of his men, who had been quietly keeping an eye on the apartment, he stood still for a long while. He had given money to countless people in his life, had used it to buy loyalty, to silence others, to make people lower their heads, and not one of them, not one, had ever refused it. Yet this woman, poor enough to work the night shift to support her child, had returned every bit of it simply because she believed it didn't belong to her. In that moment, something in the hardened shell he had spent so many years building cracked open by one small line. He realized that he had insulted her without even knowing it, that he had tried to repay a generous heart with the one thing that heart had never cared about. And for the first time in many years, Dorian Vale felt that he truly didn't understand another human being, and that very fact made it impossible for him to stop thinking about her. While Dorian couldn't stop thinking about the woman who had returned his money, at the hotel where Marla worked, her life continued beneath the shadow of a man she feared even more than the 3 men in black from that alley at night. His name was Garrett Cole, the hotel's night shift manager, a middle-aged man whose smile was always on his lips whenever his superiors were present and vanished the moment only the employees under him remained. Garrett understood very well that people who worked the night shift, people like Marla, had no voice, that they were desperate enough to endure almost anything just to keep their jobs, and he exploited that without the slightest hesitation. The way he operated was very subtle. Every time payday came, he always found some reason to cut their hours, sometimes claiming they had arrived late, even though they had been there on time, sometimes using the excuse that a room hadn't been cleaned to standard so he could dock their pay, and no one knew whose pocket that missing money flowed into. Those whose wages were cut only dared lower their heads, because they knew that if they opened their mouths to object, what they lost wouldn't be just a few dollars, but the very job that kept their families alive. One night, Marla saw him corner an older coworker against a wall. The woman had worked at the hotel for many years, trembling as she held a payslip that had been cut almost in half, stammering as she asked why, and Garrett merely leaned back against the wall, folded his arms, and looked at her with the eyes of a man savoring someone else's misery. "You think you have any other choice?" he said, his voice syrupy and cold-edged. "At your age, who out there is going to hire you? I'm already being kind by keeping you on. If you're not satisfied, go ahead and leave. There are hundreds of people outside waiting in line for your spot." The woman lowered her head, folded the payslip, and quietly turned away, while Marla stood tucked behind the corner of the hallway, clenching her fists so tightly that her nails dug into her palms, feeling pity for her coworker and fury at the sight before her, yet unable to do anything, because she understood that she was no different from that woman. And then her turn came. A few days later, Garrett called her into his small office at the end of the hallway, shut the door, then tossed her payslip onto the desk in front of her. She looked down and saw that the amount had been cut by 1/3 of what she deserved to receive. "Is there some mistake here, sir?" she said, trying to keep her voice calm. "I didn't miss a single shift this month, and I wasn't late either." Garrett leaned back in his chair, propped his feet up, and looked at her with a chilling kind of amusement. "A mistake? Not at all. Do you remember that room on the 4th floor last week? The guest complained that the towels didn't smell fresh enough. That was your fault. And I hear you've been wandering around the area behind the hotel lately during hours when you had no business being there. What were you doing back there, Marla?" Her heart tightened when she heard that, but she forced her face not to change. Garrett leaned forward and lowered his voice. "I'm keeping an eye on you. A single mother raising a small child, buried in debt, with a job that's hanging by a thread. You need this position more than anyone, so I suggest you learn to behave. Do what I tell you, and stop asking too many questions about these payslips. Do you understand?" Marla gripped the edge of her shirt, her throat closing with humiliation and anger, but she said nothing. She thought of Posey sleeping at home, thought of the rent she still owed, thought of the bills she didn't yet know how to manage, and the anger inside her was swallowed back down into the depths of her heart. "Yes, I understand," she said softly, her voice flat and steady, then picked up the slashed payslip and walked out of the room with her back straight and her eyes stinging. She didn't yet know that the noose Garrett was slowly tightening around her neck was about to pull even tighter, and she also didn't know that this very rope, in a way no one could have expected, was about to lead 2 completely foreign worlds crashing into each other. The fact that the woman had returned every dollar made it impossible for Dorian to push her out of his mind, and for a man used to controlling everything, not fully understanding something was the most unbearable feeling in the world. He wanted to know who she was, wanted to understand why a human being in such desperate circumstances could refuse the very thing an entire city would have been willing to kneel for. So he gave his men a discreet assignment, not to harm her, but to learn about her life, so he could find a way to repay her that she wouldn't be able to refuse. Within a few days, the information was brought to his desk, and as he read through it, piece by piece, a truth gradually took shape before him that left even him stunned. Her name was Marla Hayes, 28 years old, widowed, raising a little daughter on her own, carrying on her shoulders the debts left behind by her late husband. She worked the night shift as a housekeeper at a hotel in the city so she could spend her days with her child. Up to that point, everything only deepened his admiration for her resilience. But then his eyes stopped on another name buried inside the file. The name of the manager at the place where she worked. Garrett Cole. Dorian frowned. That name wasn't unfamiliar to him. In recent months, his people had reported several times about a man who specialized in bleeding and crushing powerless workers in that area, a man who hid behind the title of manager to wring the sweat from people who had no means to fight back, and the name Garrett Cole had already been placed on the list of men Dorian intended to deal with. In that moment, two pieces that had seemed to have nothing to do with each other suddenly locked into place, and Dorian sat motionless in his chair, feeling as though the entire room had gone silent. The woman who had risked her life to save him in that dark alley, the woman who had returned his money out of self-respect, was one of the victims being oppressed day after day by the very man he had sworn to punish. Fate was so bitterly ironic that he almost laughed, but that laugh never escaped him, because in its place came an emotion he wasn't used to naming. An urge to protect someone he barely knew. He rose and walked to the glass window overlooking the city, and in his mind, a decision slowly began to form. He would act. He wouldn't allow Garrett Cole to keep tightening his grip around her throat and the throats of people like her for even one more day. But the moment that thought sparked to life, another thought immediately slowed it down. If he appeared openly, if he let Marla know that the man she had once hidden beneath a pile of white towels was the very boss even the police treated with caution, then he would drag her and her little girl into the very world that had nearly taken his life in that alley at night. He had no shortage of enemies, and anyone who stood too close to him could become a target. He had seen that happen before, had paid the highest possible price for failing to protect someone he cared about, and he didn't want to repeat that mistake one more time. So Dorian made the choice he believed was the right one. He would help her. He would expose Garrett. He would return to her the justice she deserved. But he would do all of it from the shadows, leaving no trace, never letting her know whose hand was shielding her. She would never have to know of his existence, and that way, she would be safe. He turned to Wade, who was still standing quietly beside him, and gave the order in a low, decisive voice. Find out everything about Garrett Cole. Every dollar he's skimmed, every person he's driven into a corner. I want to know all of it. But under no circumstances is that woman to be tied to my name. Wade nodded and accepted the order. But Dorian had no idea that the very man he was trusting with this secret was the one who would betray him. While Dorian was quietly preparing his plan from the shadows, on the other side of the city, a turn of events Marla could never have foreseen was bearing down on her. The worry she had tried to bury for months, the worry about Posey's health that she kept telling herself was only a small matter, finally forced her to face it. One afternoon, when she came to pick up her daughter from Mrs. Eleanor's place, she saw that the little girl was more tired than usual, and this time a mother's instinct wouldn't allow her to comfort herself with excuses anymore. She gathered the little money she had managed to save and took her child to a hospital in the city for the tests she should have arranged long ago. She sat in the hospital corridor for hours, her hands locked tightly together, praying the doctor would come out and tell her that everything was fine. But when the doctor appeared with a folder in his hand and a gentle, sympathetic look in his eyes, she knew the news that was coming wouldn't be easy to hear. He invited her into the room, sat across from her, and explained in a voice that was soft but clear that Posey's little heart had a congenital defect, a problem in the structure of the heart that had been silently present all this time, and now it had reached the point where intervention was needed. The child needed surgery, he said, and it was a complicated operation that required a skilled specialist team. The good news was that if the surgery was done in time, her chances of recovery were very high, and afterward Posey could grow up healthy, running and playing like any other child. At those words, a spark of hope flashed inside Marla, but it went out the instant the doctor began speaking about the cost of that surgery. The number he gave her was so large that Marla felt as if the ground beneath her feet had collapsed. It was an amount of money she couldn't possibly gather even if she worked without rest for many years, even if she didn't eat, didn't spend, didn't allow herself a single unnecessary thing. She sat there with the paper listing the cost trembling in her hand, and for the first time after so many years of forcing herself to endure, she felt her strength drain away completely. She was used to poverty, used to always being short, used to sleepless nights full of worry, but this was the first time she had faced something that even her resilience and her pride couldn't overcome. That evening, after bringing her daughter home and soothing the little girl into peaceful sleep, Marla sat alone beside the wooden table with the peeling paint the same table where only a few days earlier the envelope she had returned had been placed. She looked down at the hospital paper, then looked around her poor apartment, and a bitter thought suddenly crossed her mind. What if she had kept that money back then? But she immediately pushed it away, because she knew that even if she had kept it, it still wouldn't have come close to the enormous number now hanging in front of her. She lowered her face into both hands, and for the first time, she allowed herself to cry. Not because she was exhausted, not because she felt sorry for herself, but because of the most primal and desperate fear a mother could know, the fear that she wouldn't be able to save the only child in her life. She didn't know whom to ask for help, didn't know which door to knock on, didn't know where she could possibly find a miracle tomorrow. The whole world seemed to have turned its back on that invisible woman, and in the still darkness of the small apartment, Marla had no idea that the miracle she was begging for in despair had been silently watching over her for a long time, and was about to reach out from the place she least expected. News of Marla's situation reached Dorian only one day later, because from the moment he had decided to silently watch over her life, he had instructed his men to report every change to him, no matter how small. When he heard that her little daughter had a heart condition and needed a surgery she had no way to afford, Dorian sat in silence for a very long time in his office. He said nothing, only slowly set down the file in his hand, and in those eyes that were usually so cold, something flickered that even Wade, standing beside him, had never seen before. He had watched countless people beg him for help in his life, had grown used to weighing whether each plea brought him some advantage, whether it threatened him, whether it was worth his concern. But this time was different. This woman had never asked him for anything. She didn't even know he existed in her life. And precisely because she expected nothing from him, he couldn't turn his back. Dorian stood, picked up the phone, and began to act with the decisiveness and precision of a man accustomed to commanding an entire empire. He called the director of the finest specialty hospital in the city, a man who owed him a favor and had long been waiting for the chance to repay it. He arranged for Posey to be placed on the surgical list, to be received by the best medical team, and to be scheduled for the earliest possible operation instead of having to wait for months as usual. Every expense, from the hospital fees to the medicine to the recovery afterward, he arranged to be paid through a scheduled automatic transfer from his primary account. But he set one condition, and he emphasized it in a voice that allowed no argument. Absolutely no one was to reveal the identity of the person paying. That mother only needed to know that an anonymous benefactor had stepped forward to help. Nothing more and nothing less. He wasn't doing this so she would be grateful to him. He wasn't doing this in exchange for anything from her. He did it simply because it was the thing that had to be done. And for the first time in a long, endless life spent among calculation and power, Dorian carried out an act that held no benefit for himself at all. A few days later, while Marla was sitting in a daze, calculating what she could sell, where she could borrow money, how many more jobs she could take on to gather enough for her daughter's surgery, her phone rang. On the other end was someone from the hospital. They informed her that Posey's surgery had been arranged, that the little girl would be operated on by top doctors as soon as possible, and that she didn't need to worry about the cost, because the entire medical package had been officially secured and guaranteed by an anonymous benefactor's account. Marla stood frozen, the phone pressed to her ear, unable to believe what she had just heard. She asked again and again whether they had mistaken her for someone else, whether this was truly meant for her daughter. And when she received a firm answer, her legs gave way beneath her, and tears spilled out beyond her control. She pressed them to tell her who had done this, saying she wanted to thank that person, even if only with a single word. But all she received in return was a polite refusal, explaining that the benefactor wished to remain unnamed. Marla clutched her chest, crying and laughing at once in choked emotion, her heart overflowing with gratitude toward a nameless person she was certain she had never met. She couldn't possibly have known that the hand quietly lifting her and her child through this disaster was the very hand she had once pulled back from death's scythe in that dark alley. Marla's joy and relief didn't last long, because while she was living through days filled with hope for her daughter's surgery, somewhere else inside the hotel, Garrett Cole was beginning to realize that the small empire of power he had worked so hard to build was starting to shake. Dorian's people had quietly begun their work, silently gathering every piece of evidence about the money he had skimmed, every statement from the employees he had once pushed into corners, and though Garrett didn't yet know who was behind it, he could feel that some invisible force was closing a circle around him. With the cunning of a man who survived by schemes, he followed the threads, And then he discovered that one of the names this hidden force seemed interested in protecting was Marla Hayes, the night shift housekeeper he had always looked down on. He didn't understand why a poor, lowly woman like her could be connected to what was happening, but a vicious thought immediately took shape in his mind, that if she was a pawn of his enemy, then he had to remove her first, had to destroy her credibility and her voice before she could become a threat. And Garrett, in all his cowardly nature, chose the filthiest way to strike. One evening, while Marla was cleaning as usual, he summoned her to a luxury room on one of the upper floors, the room of a wealthy guest who had just checked out. He told her to go in and clean, and Marla didn't suspect a thing. She simply walked in and began doing her job. But only a few minutes later, Garrett returned with 2 security employees and a senior hotel manager, loudly declaring that an expensive piece of jewelry belonging to the guest who had just left had gone missing, and that the last person inside that room had been Marla. She froze, unable to understand what was happening, stammering as she insisted she hadn't taken anything at all. But Garrett had prepared everything with chilling care. When they searched her cleaning cart, the piece of jewelry lay tucked beneath the towels, exactly where he had ordered someone to hide it. Every gaze fell on her, and in that moment, Marla understood that she had fallen into a trap already laid for her, with no way out. She was taken downstairs and held there to wait for the police. And in the brightly lit hallway, in front of the co-workers who had once worked the night shift beside her, Garrett stood with his arms folded and triumph on his face, loudly humiliating her, saying he had always known that people like her couldn't be trusted, that someone poor and buried in debt would do anything for money. Her co-workers lowered their heads, and not one of them dared speak up for her, because they were afraid that if they opened their mouths, they would be the next ones crushed by him. Marla stood there, alone among people she had once thought of as friends, carrying a crime she hadn't committed, and she felt as if the whole world was collapsing around her. But what terrified her most wasn't the humiliation, nor even the loss of the job that kept her and her daughter alive. What made her heart seem to stop was the thought of Posey, a mother branded as a thief, arrested, unemployed. How could such a mother prove she was fit to raise her child? She thought of the possibility that they might take away her little girl, the child who, in only a few days, would enter the most important surgery of her life, and that fear strangled her so tightly she could hardly breathe. She tried to explain, tried to beg someone to believe her, but the words of a poor housekeeper carried no weight at all against evidence that had been staged too perfectly. In that darkest and loneliest hour, when it seemed there wasn't a single ray of light left, Marla had no idea that the news of her being framed was spreading very quickly, and was about to reach the ears of the only person in the world powerful enough to turn the entire game upside down. In that dark moment, as she stood in the hallway, with an unjust accusation weighing on her shoulders and suspicious eyes closing in around her, something inside Marla awakened instead of collapsing. She thought of Posey, thought of the surgery waiting for her child, and she understood that if she gave up now, if she let fear drown her, she would lose everything forever. The woman who had grown used to lowering her head and enduring for so many years suddenly lifted her face, and in her tear-filled eyes flashed a hard, steady light even Garrett hadn't expected to see. She didn't scream, didn't cry, didn't beg anymore. Instead, she began to think quickly, with a calm that was almost strange. She remembered that throughout her shift that evening, she hadn't been alone, that there were hallways with cameras she had passed through, that there were co-workers who had seen her working in another area at the exact time he claimed the jewelry had disappeared. She spoke up, her voice trembling but clear, demanding to review the hotel's surveillance footage, saying those recordings would prove she hadn't been in that room at the moment the item was supposedly missing. Garrett's expression changed for a brief instant, and he hurriedly brushed it aside, claiming the system was having problems, but it was precisely his rushed denial that made a few people begin to frown with suspicion. Marla didn't stop there. She turned toward the co-workers standing with their heads lowered, and instead of blaming them for their silence, she spoke to them in a voice that was both firm and pleading. She reminded them that for so long, all of them had silently endured Garrett's exploitation, the wages cut without reason, the threats, the humiliations everyone had swallowed because they were afraid of losing their jobs. She said she understood their fear, because she herself had been afraid in the same way. But if all of them kept lowering their heads today, then tomorrow another one of them would be framed by him, just as she was being framed now. Her words seemed to touch something that had been pressed down for too long in the hearts of those suffering people. An older woman, the very one Marla had once seen Garrett tear half her paycheck away from, was the first to step forward. She was trembling but resolute, saying that she had seen Marla cleaning on another floor at that exact time, and that she was willing to testify. Then another person, and another, began speaking up one by one, as if Marla's courage had lit in them a flame they had long believed had gone out. More important than anything, during the months she had worked under Garrett, Marla had quietly kept her own cut pay slips, not because she had intended to accuse anyone, but simply because she was careful and always saved every document. Now those pieces of paper, which had once seemed meaningless, suddenly became living evidence of his systematic fraud. In front of the high-ranking manager, she declared that she wouldn't stay silent, that she would bring everything into the light, that if the police came, she would tell them everything she knew about the real Garrett Cole. For the first time, the manager who had always been so smug felt the game slipping from his hands, and a flicker of panic crossed his face. Marla knew her battle was nowhere near over, knew that she alone, with a few old pay slips and the testimony of powerless people, might still not be enough to bring down a cunning and well-connected man like him. But she was no longer the helpless woman she had been yesterday. She had stood up, had fought for herself and for all those who hadn't dared to fight, and that courage of hers, though she had no idea, was about to become the final piece a powerful hand had been waiting for, in order to bring down the killing blow. Just as Garrett was trying to claw back control, trying to raise his voice and drown out the testimony that was slowly turning against him, the large door at the end of the hotel hallway swung open, and a strange silence immediately settled over everyone. A man walked in, his steps unhurried yet full of authority, his dark suit tailored to perfection, and behind him, several men quietly spread out and took their positions. No one needed to introduce him, and no word needed to be spoken. His presence alone seemed to freeze the entire space. Garrett was the first to sense that something was wrong, because he had lived long enough in the hidden corners of the city to recognize the scent of real power. And when his eyes met the dark, cold eyes of that man, his face began to drain of color. Marla looked up too, and when she recognized that face, she was so stunned she forgot to breathe. It was the man she had once saved in the alley, the man whose wound she had bandaged in her poor apartment, the man who had left quietly without a single goodbye. But the man standing before her now was no longer the one who had collapsed, barely breathing, that night. He stood there with all the solemn authority of a man the entire city had reason to fear, and for the first time, she dimly understood the mysterious warnings he had once spoken to her. Dorian didn't look at her right away. His gaze was fixed straight on Garrett, and when he spoke, his voice was level and low, yet every word was as sharp as ice. "Garrett Cole, I've heard a great deal about you." Garrett forced a smile and stammered as he asked who he was, but Dorian didn't bother answering that question. Instead, he gave a slight signal, and one of his men stepped forward, placing a thick file on a nearby table. "This is everything you've done over the past several years," Dorian said, his voice never rising. "Every dollar in wages you stole from people who had no way to fight back. Every name you pushed out onto the street to keep them quiet. The accounts where you hid the money you skimmed. I have all of it, including statements from the people you thought were too frightened to ever open their mouths." Garrett staggered back one step, his eyes fixed on the file as if he were staring at his own death sentence. He tried to struggle, loudly insisting that it was all slander, that Dorian had no proof. But Dorian only moved slowly one step closer, and that single step silenced him completely. "Do you know what your greatest mistake was, Garrett?" he said. "It wasn't that you were greedy. There are countless greedy men in this world. Your mistake was choosing the wrong person to trample. You put your filthy hands on someone you should never have touched." He paused, and this time he glanced briefly toward Marla, only for an instant, but it was enough for Garrett to understand everything, enough for him to realize that the invisible force that had been closing around him all this time was the man standing in front of him, and that the poor housekeeper he had just framed was the very person this powerful man was protecting. His face turned white, his legs trembled, and for the first time in his life, the man who specialized in planting fear in others tasted what it felt like to have that fear choke him. "I don't need to lay a hand on you," Dorian continued, his voice so cold that even those watching felt a shiver run through them. "I only need to bring all of this into the light. Let the law deal with you, and let every person you ever looked down on see who you truly are." He didn't need to raise a fist, didn't need to make any crude threat. He only stood there, quietly exposing every one of Garrett's sins like a judge reading an indictment. and it was that absolute calm that made him most terrifying. Garrett Cole, the man who had once believed he held the lives of those beneath him in his hands, now stood rooted to the hotel hallway, understanding clearly that he had lost, and that he had lost in a way that could never be undone. In the days that followed, everything Dorian had laid out before Garrett became reality, one thing after another. That thick file was delivered to exactly the places it needed to go, and the machinery of the law, which for so long had been unable to touch a cunning man who knew how to hide, now had enough evidence in hand to begin its work. The investigation dragged into the light everything Garrett had done over all those years, from the wages he had systematically skimmed to the methods he had used to intimidate and silence the people beneath him. The hotel immediately severed every connection with him, and the reputation he had once used to terrorize others now turned back and crushed him instead. The man who had once stood arrogantly in the hallway humiliating others now had to lower his head and face the consequences of his own actions, with no one left for him to threaten, no more noose left for him to tighten around anyone's throat. But the most meaningful thing wasn't Garrett's collapse. It was what happened to the people he had once trampled on. For the first time after so many years of living in fear, those night shift workers lifted their heads. The older woman who had once trembled while holding the payslip he had torn apart now stepped forward and told the whole story in a clear, steady voice, and the others followed one after another, speaking out as if a dam held under pressure for far too long had finally burst. The money Garrett had stolen from them was traced and returned, but what they recovered that was more precious than money was their dignity, and the belief that powerless people like them could still be protected, that justice wasn't a luxury reserved only for the rich. And in the middle of all of it, Marla was completely cleared. The surveillance footage, the very thing Garrett had tried to hide, was brought out and proved clearly that she had never set foot in the room where the piece of jewelry had supposedly disappeared. The false accusation that had weighed so heavily on her was lifted, her honor was restored, and the co-workers who had once lowered their eyes in silence now came to her not with suspicion, but with genuine gratitude, because they understood that it was her courage to stand up that night that had lit the flame that made all of them dare to speak. Marla stood among those people, her heart rising with an emotion she could hardly describe, both relieved and deeply moved. But deep down, she knew that all these miracles couldn't possibly have happened on their own. She remembered the man who had appeared in the hallway that day, remembered how everything changed only after he walked in, and she began to dimly realize that the hand, quietly turning the fate of her life and so many others, was the hand of that mysterious man. She tried to ask around, wanting to see him again so she could properly thank him. But he had vanished once more, quietly withdrawing into the shadows as soon as the work was done, just as he had once left her apartment. He still hadn't let her know who he truly was, still kept distance between his world and her life, because in his heart he was still tormented by the fear that being close to someone like him could only bring danger to her and her little child. Marla didn't know all the calculations behind that choice. She only felt that there was a strangely good man silently protecting her and her daughter, and every night before she went to sleep, she quietly prayed that her nameless benefactor would be safe. She had no idea that just as her life had begun to open toward a faint ray of light, somewhere else in the city, a dark shadow from the very past of the man protecting her was quietly rising, and the true storm still lay ahead. For a few brief days, it seemed as though life had finally agreed to smile on Marla. At night, she sat beside her daughter's bed, watching Posy sleep peacefully with the stuffed rabbit in her hands, and for the first time in months, she felt her chest grow light. The surgery had been arranged, her honor had been restored, and some invisible benefactor was watching over and protecting mother and child. She allowed herself to believe that the dark days had passed, but that peace was only as fragile as the first ice of early winter, and beneath it, a violent current was surging, though she had no idea it was there. On the other side of the city, in a dark room, a man sat silently pouring himself a glass of liquor, and on his lips was a faint, calculating smile. His name was Wade Lockhart. All this time, standing beside Dorian with an air of calm and absolute loyalty, no one had suspected that he was the one who had been quietly weaving the net of betrayal. He was the man behind the ambush in that alley at night, the one who had hired those shadows to hunt Dorian down and had almost taken his life, if a stranger's hand hadn't reached out to save him. Wade wasn't some ordinary underling like Garrett. He had been by Dorian's side long enough to understand every move he made, every link in the empire Dorian had built, and more important than anything, he understood Dorian himself down to the deepest part of him. He didn't bother attacking him with force anymore, because he knew a direct confrontation wouldn't be easy. Instead, he chose a far smarter and far crueler way. He aimed straight at the root of Dorian's power. For months, while hiding in plain sight, Wade had quietly connected himself to those who had always envied and hated Dorian, bribed some of the people Dorian had once trusted, and step by step seized control of the streams of money, the accounts, and the business relationships that were the lifeblood feeding the entire empire. And then, at the very moment Dorian was pouring his attention and resources into protecting Marla and her daughter, at the moment he was least guarded because of worries he had never known in his life, Wade struck. Within a single night, a series of Dorian's accounts were frozen, enormous sums of his money were locked away, and the people he had believed loyal turned against him all at once under Wade's command. An entire network of power that Dorian had spent years building was suddenly paralyzed, like a body whose arteries had been severed. By the time Dorian realized what was happening, it was already too late to stop it completely. He stood in the middle of his office, listening to one report after another about the collapse spreading through his world, and for the first time in a very long time, he felt the ground beneath his feet begin to shake. But what hurt him most wasn't the money or the power being stripped away from him. What made his heart clench was the realization that the man behind all of this was Wade, the person he had trusted more than anyone else, the man he had once treated as his right hand. That betrayal cut deeper than any blade, because it stirred in him an old pain he had thought long buried, the helpless feeling of watching something precious be torn from his hands while he could do nothing. And then, in the midst of that crisis, another piece of news came crashing down and left him stunned. Because his financial sources had been completely frozen, the payments he had quietly arranged for Posey's surgery were interrupted as well. The hospital, unaware of the hidden war unfolding beneath the surface, was forced to postpone the operation until the issue of payment could be resolved. Wade might not even have known the little girl existed. He had only aimed at Dorian's money, but his blow had accidentally struck the most fragile and precious thing of all, the life of an innocent child. Dorian clenched his hand so tightly that his knuckles turned white, understanding that now he was not only fighting to reclaim his empire, but also racing against time to save the little heart he had silently promised to protect. Standing amid the wreckage of the empire that had once seemed untouchable, Dorian was forced to make the fastest and most important decisions of his life, because time was no longer on his side. He understood that he had to fight on two fronts at once, and neither one allowed him the right to lose. On one side, he had to take back control from Wade before the man could seize everything completely and turn betrayal into an accomplished fact. On the other, and this was what filled his chest with a strange, burning urgency, he had to open the flow of money for Posey's surgery again before it was too late, because every day of delay was another day that placed that small life in danger. As he threw himself into that battle, a distant memory he had buried for several decades suddenly returned, so vivid that it nearly choked him. He remembered a boy from long ago, a boy who had grown up in poverty with his gentle mother, the only woman who had ever loved him without condition. He remembered that fateful day when the powerful men in that neighborhood came to collect things that he and his mother could never possibly pay, remembered the sight of his mother being pushed into a corner while everyone around them looked away, with no one daring to stand up for her, no one daring to reach out and help. The boy from those years had been too small and too helpless to protect the person he loved, and he had lost his mother in pain and absolute loneliness. It was from that pain that Dorian Vale had forged himself into a man who would never again have to endure helplessness, a man who climbed toward the highest reaches of power, only so he would never have to stand by and watch the weak be trampled without being able to do anything. Now, when he thought of Marla, the woman who had stretched out her hands to save a stranger in a dark alley without a single calculation, the woman who had done the very thing no one had been willing to do for him and his mother long ago, and when he thought of her little girl lying there waiting for a miracle, he understood that this time he absolutely could not fail. With his familiar coldness and sharp precision, Dorian began to strike back. He summoned the remaining people who were truly loyal to him, those Wade could not buy, and followed every trace the man had left behind in his haste to move. It turned out that in his ambition to swallow everything too quickly, Wade had made mistakes, leaving behind evidence of how he had illegally seized and manipulated the flow of money. Dorian gathered it all, piece by piece, with the patience of a hunter tracking his prey. He used the connections he still had left, people who still owed him favors and respect, to slowly unravel the net Wade had cast. He worked without rest for days and nights, refusing to allow himself a pause, because he knew every passing hour was precious. He didn't use guns or violence, but the very weapons that had lifted him to the top: intelligence, information, and a will that nothing could shake. One by one, the frozen accounts were opened again as he proved Wade's fraud, and one by one, the traders began to realize they had placed their bets on the wrong side when the game started to turn. But even after reclaiming most of what had been taken, Dorian still couldn't breathe in relief, because Wade was a far more cunning and dangerous opponent than he had imagined, and the man still held one final card that could overturn everything. The confrontation between two men who had once stood side by side had now reached its decisive hour, and Dorian understood that to bring it all to an end, to save Posey's surgery, and to protect the woman who had rekindled in him a light he had believed long extinguished, he would need one final piece. A piece even he never expected would come from the most distant place. The final card Wade held was the very thing that made him confident he would win. In his hands were documents proving legal control over most of Dorian's assets, forged so carefully that even Dorian would have difficulty refuting them before the law. To overturn everything, Dorian needed something that could prove Wade was the one behind the ambush years ago, that he had betrayed him and plotted to kill him from the beginning, because only by exposing that betrayal could everything Wade had seized be declared illegal. But on the night he was hunted through that alley, Dorian had almost lost consciousness completely, and he had no evidence in his possession showing who had truly been the mastermind. All he had was suspicion, and suspicion didn't carry enough weight. It was in that most desperate moment that something no one expected happened. Marla, after gradually fitting the pieces together, and realizing that the anonymous benefactor protecting her and her daughter was the man she had once saved, found a way to contact him and ask to see him. And when she heard fragments of the battle he was facing, about the traitor he couldn't expose, she suddenly remembered something. The night she had pulled him out of the darkness and brought him back to her apartment, when she removed his torn, blood-soaked suit jacket to bandage his wound, she had found a shattered phone and a few other belongings in his pocket. Because she was a careful person, she had kept all of those items, wrapped them neatly, and placed them in a drawer, intending to return them to him if they ever met again, because she believed that if they belonged to him, then he had the right to receive them back. Among those seemingly worthless things was a small device she had never known the purpose of, and it turned out to be the very thing that had recorded Dorian's conversations and contacts in the hours before the ambush, the only evidence that could point directly to Wade as the man who had arranged the entire trap that night. When Marla handed him the small bag containing the belongings she had preserved all that time, Dorian held it in his hand and could hardly believe his own eyes. The thing he had been searching for in desperation, the final piece that could turn the entire life and death game around, had been in the hands of the woman he had tried so hard to keep at a distance in order to protect her. She had saved him once in that dark alley, and now, without ever intending to, she had saved him again. With the evidence in hand, Dorian delivered the decisive blow. He brought everything into the light, proving before the authorities that Wade was not only a man who had illegally seized assets, but also the mastermind behind an attempted murder conspiracy. The network Wade had worked so carefully to build collapsed at once, because once the betrayal was exposed, those who had followed him for profit quickly turned their backs, and no one wanted to sink with a ship already going down. Control of the stolen assets was returned to Dorian, and Wade, the man who had once been so certain victory was in his grasp, was completely brought down by the very evidence preserved by the hands of the woman he had looked down on. He was stripped of everything, left without a single power to lean on, facing the ending he had brought upon himself. Dorian stood there, watching the traitor finally fall, but there was no satisfaction in his heart, only a deep, shaken silence, because he understood that the person who had just saved his life and his empire, once again, was the very woman to whom he owed more than anyone else in the world. Once the empire had returned to Dorian's hands, and the frozen streams of money had begun to flow again, the first thing he did was not strengthen his own power, but immediately restore every arrangement for Posey's surgery. In the shortest time possible, the little girl was placed back on the surgical list, and the finest team of doctors was ready once more. That great day finally came. Marla sat for hours outside the operating room, her hands clasped tightly together, praying in silence, and every minute that passed felt to her like an entire century. Then the door opened. The doctor walked toward her, and from the relieved smile on his face, she knew the answer before he even spoke. The surgery had been successful. Posey's little heart had been healed, and she would recover completely, would grow up healthy like any other child. Marla burst into tears, but they were the tears she had been waiting for her whole life, the tears of a mother who had just been given back the most precious thing in the world. In the days that followed, as Posey slowly recovered, Marla finally had time to sit quietly and piece together all the scattered fragments life had thrown into her hands during all that time. She thought of the anonymous benefactor who had arranged her daughter's surgery, thought of the powerful man who had appeared to save her from Garrett's trap, and thought of the wounded stranger she had once pulled from the darkness in that alley. And then, like lightning tearing through the night, she suddenly understood that all those people were actually one and the same. When Dorian came to see her, this time no longer hiding and no longer leaving in haste, she was standing there waiting for him with reddened eyes and a heart overflowing with emotions she couldn't name. They stood facing each other in a long silence, a silence heavy with everything that had happened between two people from two separate worlds. "It was you," she finally said, her voice trembling. "The one who saved my daughter. The one who gave me back my honor. All this time, it was you, wasn't it?" Dorian didn't deny it. He looked at her, and on that usually cold face now rested a tenderness, perhaps even he had never expected himself to still be capable of showing. "You saved me on the night I should have died," he said softly. "You did it without needing to know who I was, without asking for anything. In my entire life, I've never met anyone like you. I couldn't stand by and watch you and your daughter suffer. I owed you a life, and I was only trying to repay that debt." Tears rolled down Marla's face. She thought of that fateful night, of that brief 3-second moment when she had chosen to reach out and save a stranger, and she realized that the tiny choice that had once seemed almost meaningless had turned the entire life of her and her daughter around. "I saved you when you were dying," she whispered, her voice breaking, "and you saved my child when she needed it most. So between us, no one owes anyone anymore." Dorian gave a faint smile, a rare and honest smile. The circle had closed in a way so complete it almost felt impossible. Two strangers who had taken turns saving each other and saving what mattered most to each of them, and in that quiet moment, they both understood that fate had woven their lives together in a way no words could ever explain. They had found in each other the thing both had lost long ago, a belief that kindness still existed in the world, and that even in the darkest corners, light always found a way back. After all the storms had passed, Dorian Vale's life turned onto an entirely new page. The man who had once sat at the summit of a dangerous underworld now realized that all the power he had worked so hard to build could not compare with the peace he found beside an honest woman and her little girl. He chose to let go. He quietly withdrew from the world that had nearly taken his life, handed back what needed to be handed back, dismantled what needed to be dismantled, and used most of his fortune to do the kind of good he had never truly imagined before. He stepped forward to help struggling workers who had been crushed and silenced, people like Marla and her co-workers, opening new opportunities for those whom life had once turned its back on, because he understood better than anyone what it felt like to be driven into a corner with no hand reaching out. As for Marla, for the first time after so many years of forcing herself to survive in the dark, she was able to live a decent and dignified life. She no longer had to stay awake through long nights worrying, no longer had to count every loose dollar, no longer had to live in fear of men like Garrett. She found steady work where she was respected, and more important than anything, she had time to be with her daughter every day. On a beautiful afternoon, in a park filled with sunlight, Posey ran happily across the green grass, her cheeks rosy, her clear laughter ringing brightly through the air, with no trace left of the child who had once had to sit down gasping after every moment of play. The little girl was healthy, happy, and full of life, exactly as every child deserved to be. Marla sat on a bench, quietly watching her daughter, her heart overflowing with a simple happiness she had once thought she would never be able to reach. Dorian sat beside her, and when Posey ran over, innocently took the hand of the man who had once made the whole city tremble and pulled him out toward the grass to run with her. Something strange happened. The man who had long been used to coldness and authority suddenly became awkward and uncertain before the innocent smile of a child. And then slowly, a real smile, warm and sincere, spread across his face, the smile of a man who had finally found the one thing all the power and money in the world had never been able to give him. In that peaceful scene, no grand promises needed to be spoken. No elaborate ceremony was needed at all. There were only 3 people, each carrying their own wounds, now quietly healing one another, and a new beginning opening wide before them. The story of Marla and Dorian reminds us of something simple yet profound, that a small act of kindness, given without calculation, can sometimes hold the power to change destinies that seem beyond saving, and that a person's true worth does not lie in the power or wealth they possess, but in the way they treat those weaker than themselves. Kindness is never meaningless, because the light we give to others will one day find its way back to warm our own lives. If this story has touched your heart, please hit the like button, share this video with more people, and don't forget to subscribe to our channel so you can listen to many more meaningful and captivating stories every day. How do you feel about Marla and Dorian's story? Please leave a comment and share the feelings from deep within your heart, because we're always hoping to hear the most honest emotions from you. Thank you for spending your time watching. We wish you and your loved ones abundant health, a peaceful life, and joy in every single day. Goodbye for now, and we'll see you again in the next videos.